Thank you all for coming. My name is Stephen Rosen. I'm the Beton Kaneb Professor of National Security and Military Affairs, Emeritus, for the emphasis of the Emeritus. I'm the moderator for today's session in the program on U.S.-Japan relations. This event is co-sponsored by the International Security Program at the Belfer Center for Science and International Affairs at the Harvard Kennedy School. It is a genuine pleasure for me to introduce Dr. Eric Heginbotham, Principal Research Scientist, Center for International Studies at MIT. He has published extensively on Japanese and Chinese foreign policy and strategy, U.S.-Asia policy, nuclear strategy, among many other topics. Before joining MIT, he was a senior political scientist at the Rand Corporation, where he did research projects on China, Japan, and regional security issues, and regularly briefed senior military intelligence and political leaders. Heginbotham is the lead author of U.S.-China Military Scorecard, a Rand publication in 2015, co-author of China's Evolving Nuclear Deterrent, another Rand publication, 2017, and Chinese and Indian Strategic Behavior, Growing Power and Alarm. He's the editor of China in the Developing World and of China Steps Out. He's published articles extensively in all the notable journals, and he will be talking to us today on air power options for Japan based on his ongoing research on Japanese military options more broadly for the 20th century. Following Dr. Heginbotham's presentations, we will have a Q&A led by Kobayashi-san, which I will moderate and to which I hope to have the chance to contribute. Dr. Eric, real pleasure to see you. I'll turn the floor over to you.
Thank you so much. I'm delighted and honored to have Stephen here today. This is his expertise is exactly on topic. So I'll have some suggestions about Japanese air power, but I think he might be better at telling us how to get from here to there, since he's done so much extensive research on military innovation. Thanks also to Shin, wherever he is, for setting all of this up, and to David as well for hosting. So as all of you know, and as Stephen already said, I've been working on topics related to the Japanese military for many years. I have not written specifically on this topic. I'm sort of launching on that project right now with a colleague of mine, George Gilboy, but done a lot of adjacent work, including the scorecards. Most recently, wargaming project that looked at a Chinese invasion of Taiwan. We did 24 iterations of that. Our MIT grad students were involved in it. And that was published through CSIS, the results of that. And then last year, continuing that 15 iterations of a sort of nuclear extension of that game. So that is all relevant to this topic, but adjacent to it. So not all of this is mature. That, I think, is my main point here. So I'm going to start with actually what I'm not talking about today, and have to start there because if you're talking about Japanese defense, then I think it's now required by some sort of law that you have to talk about Japan's counterstrike. That seems to be what every topic is on Japan's defense these days. So for anyone not in the know, Japan is acquiring standoff strike capabilities, i.e. missiles, probably about 7 or 8 varieties of them. A couple of things that I'll mention about why I'm not talking about strike today or why I'm not focused on strike today. And I'll start off with how those missiles, how that strike capability might be employed. There are effectively sort of 2 types of strategies you can use missiles for. One would be counter value, to strike high value civilian targets, populations, cities, electrical grids, things like that, to make it very unpleasant for an adversary. I think it's probably unlikely that Japan would pursue this course in a conflict with China, which of course is a nuclear power. That would be quite dangerous from an escalation perspective and may not be supported by the United States. So the second type of strategy one can pursue using strike is counterforce against warships, air bases, fielded forces. In other words, as part of a campaign. In counterforce, missiles are just munitions. They're the bullet fired by the gun. They can be launched by a variety of platforms, aircraft, ships, submarines, ground launchers. But those launchers themselves, whether they're aircraft or ground launchers, have to survive and fight. And hopefully those platforms have other functions once the missiles are launched. So I guess my point here is that missiles do not make a military. They're part of air power, they're part of sea power, they're part of land power. The big change perhaps with long-range strike is that they do cross domains, so ground-launched missiles can strike ships at sea. They can work against air targets or ground targets, air-launched missiles, same set of targets. So they are a cross-domain capability, but they're still part of a larger mix. So today I'm going to focus on one piece of Japan's military capability, and that is air power. I have a pretty simple outline for today. I'll first talk about why air power is critical for Japan's defense and security. And then secondly, why in its current form, Japan's air power is not viable. Modern missiles pose a lethal threat to parked aircraft. It's difficult for the Japanese to overcome as far as the current structure and posture that their air power takes. And then third, what are options to sort of change the game and maintain an air power capability despite technological change? All right, I'll start off with sort of the shock value, the main message here, and then I'll come back to the outline. But forget everything else you've read about Japanese defense. I would argue this is probably the most important article that you could read about Japanese security. It came out in 2020. It's about 8 paragraphs long. I think it was published first in LiveDoor, although it may have been just reprinted there. But Kuji Zenmetsu Setsu. So the sort of hypothesis or story about how Japan's Air Force might be wiped out in 15 minutes. 15 minutes is probably debatable. I might put it at 2 weeks, but sensational military titles in the media are often wrong, but I would argue not this one, at least if you take the 15-minute part out. I think this is absolutely true, and that's really the crux of the problem here. Okay, so now I'll go back to the beginning. What do we mean by air power? I really don't want to overthink this. I'll leave that up to Stephen to tell me more about what air power really means. But I actually like Billy Mitchell's definition here, better than the US Air Force's. Air power is the ability to do something in the air. It doesn't necessarily require air control like the US air power definition seems to. But that leads us to the next set of questions, which is what is air power good for? And we could debate this as well, but just to throw some things out, it provides the high ground, and this is what early air power theorists always sort of fixated on. It's the high ground, right? So it's particularly useful for ISR, intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance. You can see the battlefield, right? It's highly flexible, so you can focus all your air power or much of your air power on a particular mission in the morning, come back to base, rearm, reload. You can have them doing a different mission that afternoon. It's also fast moving. So not only can you reallocate it to different types of tasks, but you can reallocate it to different locations as well. All right, just a couple of examples about what air power can do. I'll talk about air power in the context of anti-submarine operations. At least since World War II, air assets have been particularly useful in anti-submarine warfare. Anti-submarine warfare helicopters today operate off of pretty much all large warships, and they're supplemented by maritime patrol aircraft. They can drop sonobuoys or sensors, and they can detect submarines in a variety of ways. And then they're fast movers too. So once you get a detection, you can arrive quickly on scene, drop torpedoes, and attempt to destroy those submarines. Whether or not you want to classify anti-submarine warfare aircraft as air power, the operating anti-submarine warfare aircraft relies on having a degree of air superiority, or at least the adversary not having air superiority. So most of these aircraft, they're essentially fenceless. They may have flares, that's about it. They can't shoot back, they're slow moving, they fly in a straight line. So without this guy here, or something like him, not only can your anti-submarine warfare aircraft not fly, but perhaps the other guys can. So that's a single example in a larger class of cases. There are a lot of aircraft that do things but don't defend themselves. So some of them are communications relays, transport aircraft, ISR we already talked about, intelligence aircraft, AWACS, refuelers to refuel aircraft. There are a lot of things that fly that can't defend themselves. So without air power, those can be in a lot of trouble. All right, the second thing, second sort of example of air power and its utility is the strike mission, and this is probably what everybody does think about. So here we have an example. We have 8 Japanese F-15s escorted by another 8. Each of the 8 strikers launches 2 anti-ship missiles, long-range anti-ship missiles. And they go out and they strike a ship, right? So first of all, they can strike from beyond the range or the ability of the ship to defend itself, depending on the missiles that are being used by both sides. But the LRASM, the long-range anti-ship missile, has a range of about 600 kilometers. The defensive systems on board most destroyers, their effective range is going to be about no more than 200 kilometers against maneuvering targets, probably significantly less. Obviously, I made this example up, but there is a reason that I picked 8 strikers and 16 missiles. When we do our modeling, which I will not bore you with here, that is the average number of missiles needed to not sink, but put one major warship out of commission. So now, if you fired 16 missiles at a task force, probably all 16 are going to be shot down to no effect. So this is an average in sort of an average type of operational setting. If you fire 150 missiles at a 6-ship task force, you're likely to wipe that task force out. Not guaranteed. There are very large uncertainty bands in all of the modeling type work that we do. Nevertheless, that's kind of an expected outcome. So with 16 $2 million, $5 million missiles, whatever you want to call them, if you sink a ship that's worth $1.5 billion or $1 billion, you're going to get a very, very high return on investment, whether it's 20 to 1 or 30 to 1 or whatever. You're going to get a very high return on investment if you can do that. Okay, so I've just talked about a strike mission. Aircraft launching missiles. As I've said earlier, other things can launch missiles, but aircraft do have some advantages. I don't really want to put myself up here as the Airpower advocate, the Billy Mitchell Institute representative or anything like that. But I do think Airpower has some advantages. We could talk about some of the disadvantages. In fact, that's much of what this talk is about. But to talk through some of the advantages, in one sense at least, air-launched missiles are inexpensive. So the aircraft, of course, are expensive, but the aircraft are doing a variety of functions. Once you have the aircraft, adding the missiles is not free. You have to pay for the missiles and some storage, but almost free. Whereas if you add missiles to your ground inventory, you have to stand up a ground unit with a vehicle, right? There's a lot of infrastructure and most importantly, a lot of manpower that goes with that. You do not have to do that in the case of aircraft. Also, air-launched cruise missiles are lethal. So, I think it's true that all missiles are lethal, but the difference here is that aircraft in general can launch very large salvos. Again, they can do it in the morning, they can come back, they can do it again in the afternoon, right? Or at a minimum the next day. So, I put the example up there, 8 aircraft. Japan has 150 F-15s. Maybe not all of them can launch LRASMs or JASMs or what have you, these long-range missiles, but a lot of them could, and you could put up some fairly significant salvos. Flexibility, again, move around, target different things. I mentioned the high-end Gucci missile, the long-range anti-ship missile. The LRASM, it's got a range of 600 kilometers, but with Airpower, it becomes, voila, a missile with a 1,600 kilometer range because your aircraft has an unrefueled range of 1,000 kilometers. So you can fly out, then launch the missile and extend the range of the missile that way. And then I put down, I think, low risk. That requires a little caveat. A low risk in the sense that if you have a large warship, you've got 100 missiles on it, you've got $1.5 billion invested in it. If it goes down, it could well take not just the ship, which is massively expensive and all the equipment, but also 100 missiles with it as well. If the aircraft goes down, if one aircraft goes down, you might lose 2 missiles and a $100 million system. Again, we can debate all of this, but I think there are some advantages to Airpower. Okay, so problem being, the current sort of posture and force structure is not viable. Does anyone other than Stephen know what aircraft this is? Okay, it's a
ME-262.
Yes, thank you. I knew you'd know that. It's an ME-262. This is the world's first jet-powered fighter aircraft. It was deployed in mid-1944 by the Germans. It had a speed advantage over prop powered or driven planes of about 100 miles an hour. In the air, it achieved kill ratios. Everything in the military is debated, but roughly, I am told about 5-to-1 kill ratios in the air. So this is the Tyrannosaurus Rex of air-to-air combat in sort of late 1944, going into 1945. But this aircraft, as we all know, did not change the outcome of the war. The Germans lost. There were too few of them. And much more important, they're subject to attack in the factory, on the transportation lines, and at their bases. So on occasion, Allied fighters would wait until they glided in for their landing, cut their engines, and then attack them on the ground. Something like 1,400 of these aircraft were produced, and only 300 actually made it into combat. Most of the others were destroyed on the ground or disrupted somewhere in the supply chain. All right, in World War II, in order to attack those Me-262s on the ground, the Allies required at least some form of air superiority. That's not entirely true today. So missile forces today can threaten air bases even without first gaining air superiority. During the 2000s, the PLA, the Chinese military, invested in missiles precisely because it believed it couldn't gain air superiority through the traditional form of air-to-air combat. So today, China's missile forces have in excess of 1,000 ballistic missiles, probably in excess of 1,000, maybe many more, long-range cruise missiles. They're highly accurate, they have very long ranges. So DF-26, the CJ-20, the ground launch variant of this, all of these can range all targets all across Japan, to include in northern Japan and Hokkaido. There are other systems that can do that, DF-21s. So a variety, a large number of Chinese missiles, not all of them can range Japan's entire length and depth, but many of them can. Of these, ballistic missiles are a particularly severe threat because the flight times are short, so maybe a 8-10 minute flight time. So you're not going to be able to get the aircraft off the base based on launch warning alone. Okay, so that was the offense, the missiles that might be coming in to attack air bases. Now we'll look at the target itself. Japanese air bases, they tend to be relatively small and austere. If you compare them to US air bases, they have, less overall size, less smaller parking ramps, fewer stands, less deluxe facilities. So this is the Nyutabaru Air Base on the eastern side of Kyushu. I think it's fairly typical. I believe it houses about 48 fighters today. I'm not exactly sure. There's been some change to what's stationed there. But if we want to look at how many aircraft these missiles can destroy, we want to compare the overall footprint of the missiles themselves. So how much sort of lethal coverage they have in terms of area covered vis-a-vis the total parking area, right? If we're sort of attacking the parking areas, we're not targeting individual aircraft. We want to cover these parking areas. So we can measure out the various parking areas, and we get about 500,000 square meters. So not huge. Then the next step, looking at the lethal area covered by the missiles. I won't go into all of this. The main point here is the lethal area that a missile can cover depends on a variety of things. The size of the warhead, so how many kilograms or pounds you have in there. Typically, on a Chinese missile, you might have between 500 and 1,000 kilograms. And then accuracy matters up to a point, actually not very much in this particular case, because these missiles are fairly accurate and the area they cover is fairly large. So accuracy becomes pretty much a non-factor. But very important is the type of warhead. So here we have the blast radius, the lethal blast area of a 500 kilogram warhead that is a unitary munition. In other words, one large bomb carried by the missile. Here we have the lethal area if you have what's called submunitions, so a cluster munition. And obviously it covers a much greater area. The reason for this is that the lethal radius is a cube root function. So you can kind of do the math, but we know for a fact that China has these missiles. They rehearse with them and train with them. We don't know exactly how many, but in any case, we should expect air bases to be hit with cluster munitions. And then if you sort of put out these munitions and you look at what it might look like, China targeting the space, well, with a salvo of 24 missiles, you could pretty much cover every inch of tarmac, right, of parking area at New Tabadu. So, there may be some faulty missiles. You might lose maybe 15% to defects that either don't launch or what have you. There may be some aircraft in the air, but if you do this, if you launch an attack that does an entire sweep of all parking areas, you might on average expect to get maybe 70% of the aircraft there. So it's an extremely large problem, right, for the Japanese Air Force, for its ability to survive and operate. Okay, so then we do the sort of return on investment for missile strikes on the airbase. We already did it for the air attack on ships, but now we've got sort of the return on return on investment for this particular attack. 24 DF-16 missiles come in and attack New Tabadu. Here we'll say just 26 F-15s are parked there. They're worth $100 million a piece. Each missile costs maybe $5 million at most. So return on investment, again, huge, maybe 20 to 1, 30 to 1, 15 to 1, whatever it is, it's very, very large, right? So this is a pretty perfect picture from the perspective of defense planning. Okay, now we'll get to the guts of this major change, right? So what are the options? What might the answers be? This is what my paper sort of will present. Pieces of this I have analysis on from other projects, including the wargaming. Other pieces are sort of future research and supposition. I've got a menu at the end that's not sort of fully fully fleshed out or tested in any way. But in any case, we'll talk about what the menu of options looks like first. Okay, you've got a menu of options here, active defenses, so that's missile defense interceptors. There are a variety of different types of passive defenses that might be used. Hardening of the air bases, we'll get into that. Rapid repair of runways, this sort of thing. Dispersion of aircraft, both across military air bases and then to different locations, particularly civilian air bases, civilian airports, and preferably international airports. We'll get to that. Camouflage, concealment, and deception. And then, so we've got active, passive defense, and then two options for adjustments to what types of aircrafts might be purchased. One is very heavy investment in unmanned aerial vehicles, and we'll get to why that might solve this problem later. And then another one that I'm just going to throw out here for now, because I have not done the analysis on it, but I will introduce it anyway, is bombers that are effectively transport aircraft with palletized munitions. This is something Japan, I think, is already moving towards, may have already approved. Okay, I'll start at the beginning. Active defense. You can have two types of impact here. The first one is the most obvious. You shoot down a bunch of incoming missiles, so you have fewer incoming. You maybe shift that cost effectiveness calculation a little bit anyway in your favor. More importantly, I think, is that the fact of air defenses, having air defenses and using them in interesting and unpredictable ways, complicates an attacker's calculations. When the attacker plans missile strikes, he's not planning it strictly on these sort of cost-benefit calculation terms. He's trying to achieve a particular outcome, and he may need that portion of the Air Force out of action, that air base to go down. So if you have air defenses and you use them in creative ways, you can push an attacker to either underinvest or overinvest in a particular attack. In other words, use more missiles than they needed to, really, or fewer missiles than they needed to and have no effect, right? So you're posing dilemmas for them. Interceptors come in two flavors to match the type of attacks you might face. So one is ballistic missile defense. So interceptors that intercept ballistic missiles at very high speeds. And the other type is interceptors that go against aircraft and cruise missiles, air-breathing targets. Some missiles can do both, generally not equally well. We are getting some real-world data on how effective these are, but there's still enormous uncertainty bands. But we have some data now, or more data than we had anyway, from the Red Sea, attacks on merchant ships in the Red Sea, and U.S. destroyer intercepts against some of those attacks, as well as data from attacks on Israel and the U.S. efforts to defend against those. If a defender has enough interceptors, he might fire 2 or 3 missiles at each incoming attacking missile. So cumulatively, you're likely to get pretty good rates of interception. It's never going to be 100%, but depending on what the single shot probability of intercepting a missile with one other missile is, you might expect a range of probabilities between about 76% if your missile defenses are poor, if you're shooting at 40%, a single shot, up to 94 or potentially even higher if each one of your missiles is going out with an 80% chance of intercept and you're firing at least 2 missiles at the attackers. That's still a huge uncertainty band, 76% to 94%. But it's not 0, it's not 100%. But the main point here is that there are 3 problems. Even if you've got 100% intercept, you've got 3 other problems. The first is that defenses can be overwhelmed by very large salvos. So you may not be able to track and engage all of the attackers. You may not be able to reload your weapons fast enough. The second problem is that is your total munition stock. So you may not have enough, or you may not have enough at that particular airbase to intercept all the missiles, especially if you're sending 2 or 3 at each attacker. And then the third, which is a related point and may drive the others, is high cost. So this helps us explain why these munition stocks are low. A Patriot battery, which is 6 launchers, costs, I am told, $1 billion. So it's a very expensive unit. Each missile costs $4 million. If you're sending 2 or 3 at each incoming attacker, it's an expensive intercept. You may not be on the positive side of that sort of cost exchange there. In other words, the intercept might cost you more than the attack does. This is probably a good time to sort of pause here and talk a little bit about this whole idea of return on investment and cost exchanges. I've already introduced 3 of these: the ROI, the return on investment for aircraft attacking ships at sea, return on investment for missiles attacking aircraft on the ground, and now the sort of return on investment for using defensive missiles to intercept attackers. So a lot of times you will hear arguments, often from sort of the political classes, about, well, that's more expensive than what we're gaining. We shouldn't be doing that. But I think my point here is that you really can't look at one of these metrics in isolation, right? These aircraft have immense value. We've already seen what they can do to ships. So if you can keep them alive, if they can pull off a strike, they have enormous value. They've got operational value. They've got, in some sense, you can kind of sort of monetize that value. It's not to say we shouldn't do these calculations. We should, but we have to think about sort of the whole package, the whole gestalt here. So, we need to think of this as military competition. I guess the example that I like to use is a bullet fired by an assault rifle costs about $1. Body armor costs about $1,000. So you might say, well, that's a bad exchange ratio, right? But the real thing, the important point about buying body armor is it protects the man, right? So the man is worth not $1, not $1,000. I think in legal courts, we monetize the man at maybe $1 million, whatever you want to call it. In any case, he is your most valuable asset and he has to be protected. Spin through the rest of these a little bit faster. Okay, so active defenses, cost problems, passive defenses. So passive defenses arguably might be cheaper and less expensive and more effective rather. I'll just use one example here, hardened aircraft shelters. So you can harden various things on air bases. You can harden command facilities, you can harden munition storage. Here we have hardened aircraft shelters. These are large concrete shelters with movable steel doors. During the Cold War, the US and its allies built about 1,000 of these, spread between Europe and Asia. Almost none have been built since the Cold War. The Koreans built us a single squadron's worth. Can't remember whether it's Kunsan or Osan, but in any case, they built some, but none in Japan have been added. Today, the Japanese Air Force, depending on how you count, has about 13 squadrons of combat aircraft. They have hardened aircraft shelters for 3 squadrons. So anything that doesn't have a hardened aircraft shelter is sitting out on the tarmac. Now, a hardened aircraft shelter, is not going to protect the aircraft against a direct hit by a large munition. So if you get one of these ballistic missiles coming in and it hits the HAZ, well, that aircraft is almost certainly gone. What it does do, though, is it protects the aircraft from the cluster munitions, from those small bomblets, the 3 or 4 pound bomblets. So it's going to reduce losses. How much it reduces losses depends on how many aircraft are at the airbase, since you need to know the density to know how many aircraft are going to be destroyed by the cluster munitions. But if you do this sort of expected calculation and you're expecting a fairly crowded base, so if you've got 3 squadrons at a base, it will reduce losses by about 2/3 to have hardened aircraft shelters. It costs $8 million a piece. They do not create new billets for generals and colonels and senior officers, and no one is building them, I think mostly for this reason. The US isn't building them for their aircraft. Japanese are also not building them. The Japanese are investing in revetments, which are honestly useless, but not building hardened aircraft shelters. Okay, I'm not going to spend any time on this one, but I think it's probably time for Japan to start thinking about underground air bases or underground hangars for aircraft. So this top photo is, I think, probably a photo of Hualien. The Taiwanese have some of these bases. The Chinese mainland also has some of these bases. Essentially, you're digging a large cavern or hangar out of a mountainside, putting steel doors on it, and then running the aircraft out and in for missions. And I haven't done any numbers on it, don't know how much it costs, but probably time for Japan to start thinking about this as well for high value aircraft. Okay, more passive defense. It's open civilian airports to the military. So if we think about the sort of lethality of these attacking missiles, right? I've already mentioned how we get our expected results. It's the total footprint of the missiles that are launched against the airbase divided by the total parking area. So if you've got 1 million square meters of attacking missiles and 500,000 square meters of airbase, then the attacker can do 2 full sweeps. So if you open up more air bases, you're increasing the denominator and reducing losses proportionally. So most civilian airports are larger than most of Japan. Well, most international airports in Japan are significantly larger than most Japanese air bases. I didn't measure this one, but this is Chubu near Nagoya. And I think as far as parking space is concerned, it's probably about 4 times as large. The total area is probably 2 or 3 times as large. So significantly larger than these military bases and would offer a whole lot of parking space. And then final major point that I'll talk about is UAVs. This is the fun stuff. A little bit more offensive. Now we're not just talking defense, but UAVs come in all shapes and sizes. So it's a little bit, and UAV stands for unmanned aerial vehicle. It's a drone, right? A lot of people just call them drones. They come in all shapes and sizes, so it's misleading to lump all of them under a single term. To date, you've had really large UAVs that perform mostly ISR functions for the US military, and then smaller ones that provide a sort of greater variety of functions, some strike, some ISR. But here we see, you know, the extreme range of size and cost that you vary. So I'll start off with small handheld drones, these Mavic commercial drones that you've seen used in Ukraine so effectively and so extensively. These have been converted to military use, either for that reconnaissance mission or for bombing, right? For dropping very small bombs on the adversary. They're very, very cost effective. They have very limited range. So at most, a Mavic is going to go out 3 kilometers and come back 3 kilometers. Probably it's more like 1 kilometer and 1 kilometer because there's, you can jam the communication systems on these. But either way, it is not relevant to Japan other than maybe the defense of an island against a direct invasion. Right, so we've got 500 kilometers from Okinawa to the end of the Sakishima Islands, another 500 plus to Kyushu, so that's 1,000 kilometers. So these little drones are irrelevant. Okay, at the other end, this may also be your image. I don't know of what a drone would look like. The RQ-4, the Global Hawk, it's very large. It does have an extensive range, a total range of about 14,000 kilometers. So maybe 5,000 out and 5,000 back and some loiter time in between, but really impressive range, 24-hour total endurance flight time. So it's quite an impressive piece of work. It's got superb sensors, but it's got a number of drawbacks. It's vulnerable to anti-aircraft fire, to surface-to-air missiles. This is the reason the US has stopped using the Global Hawk. Japan's just bought 3 of them, but the US Air Force has stopped using them. They're also really surprisingly expensive, so about $120 million a copy or more than an F-35 costs. And the real kicker, the real problem here is that they require a runway to operate and therefore are not survivable on the ground. So they don't buy you out of the problem that you had, which is that the runways and anything on the runways are vulnerable. And then you have the large, even more Gucci system, the RQ-180, which looks to be maybe roughly the size of a V-2 bomber. God only knows how expensive that is. It's stealthy, so it solved one of the problems, and the US Air Force will use it, and I'm sure we'll hear amazing things about it. But again, cost, and again, requires an airbase, so again, does not really buy Japan out of its air power problem. Okay, this is where I think Japan can sort of remake its offensive air power potentially, as well as its reconnaissance missions. It may be the Goldilocks solution. You have a new generation of mid-sized drones. Please don't learn the names to these because between the time that I started to make this deck and today, we've had like 3 new front runners come out. So these are no longer the front runners. So I think we're going to see a lot of churn in these mid-sized drones, and that's a good thing, right? We're seeing a lot of very rapid development in this area, but a few general points about them. They have decent range. Let's see, I got the range on there, right? So, an operational range of potentially 2,000 kilometers. They have potentially some stealth. Some of these are stealthy, or they can be designed to be stealthy. They have some payload, so enough for 1 or 2 very small missiles or some sensors. They have significant speed, so they can keep up with combat aircraft. They're sort of high subsonic. So these are not in the same category as a lot of these ISR aircraft, which fly very slowly. And they're relatively cheap. Now that part, that's the key question is, are they going to remain cheap once the military gets a hold of them and starts to do their normal thing, which is to gold plate them and put everything on them and give them more missions and make them larger, et cetera. But as of now, potentially, if you design them correctly, they can be fairly cheap if you have them doing one relatively simple task. So we like these. So the main advantage, I talked about range, stealth, payload, speed. The main advantage of the mid-sized drone is that potentially they don't require an airbase. They may require some runway, but you might get that off a highway. Hopefully it's very short runway. The Valkyrie, which is one of these smaller drones, can be launched off a vehicle and then recovered by parachute. I'm told, if you look historically at recovering drones by parachute, a lot of times they're damaged, but I guess my answer to that would be, yeah, but that's a lot better than having them burning on a tarmac somewhere completely destroyed, right? So I think probably we can solve this problem. It might cost more money, so they might not quite be as cheap as the numbers that I put up there. But it does potentially provide an actual solution to Japan's air power problem. And then I mentioned the ersatz bomber, the palletized munitions on transport aircraft. Essentially, if you know what a pallet is, it's for packing large objects. You put these on transport aircraft, you fill them full of missiles, you drop them off the back of the aircraft in flight, and they launch their missiles, and you have just made a C-2 transport aircraft into a bomber, right? A bomb truck. And Japan has a lot of cargo aircraft, and it's buying more cargo aircraft. So this is an option, and I believe Japan is actually pursuing that. What would a viable air power strategy look like? I talked about a lot of different options on this menu. I fear that I might not have given you a good sense of what this really looks like in practice, what the combination or mix is. So I'm going to throw out a set of numbers here that's quite speculative. I'm going to do more cost work on it before we publish a paper to see if these numbers kind of add up. But the full size of the Japanese fighter inventory is about 321 combat aircraft. Has no mid-sized UAVs. It operates from roughly 9 bases. It has 60 partner aircraft shelters and 50,000 personnel. So this would be a very significant makeover if we really wanted to go in this direction and have survivable air power. The manned aircraft fleet would go down by 2/3 to free up the funds and space for the rest of this to happen. You might get, despite the fact that these mid-sized UAVs are only 10% the cost of an aircraft, you still need maintainers for them. You need a lot of personnel. So you're not going to get that much cost savings, but you still might get a 3-to-1 return, right? If, in other words, you might be able to support 3 of these mid-sized UAVs for the cost of supporting 1 manned aircraft. Operating bases, we're going to open up some international airports, full-size aircraft houses. So these are hardened aircraft shelters for the fighter inventory, possibly for other things. If you made me king for the day, I would have 3 times as many aircraft shelters as I would have aircraft, rather than 6 times as many aircraft for the number of hardened aircraft shelters. And then one of the many problems with this scheme, personnel. I think this is going to require more personnel than Japan's Air Force currently has. Again, these are all quite notional, and preliminary would probably be a nice way of putting it. How likely is any of this to actually happen? I think highly, highly unlikely. There are sort of bureaucratic obstacles to every single piece of this. I'm going to ask Professor Rosen to tell us exactly why that's the case, but to ask an Air Force to give up their manned aircraft, that's going to be a difficult discussion. To buy UAVs, that's probably the most likely of these to be adopted, but how are you going to free up the money if you haven't cut the size of the manned aircraft fleet? Operating bases, that's more of a political and legal set of problems. HAZs. Rand Corporation, I used to work at Rand for about a dozen years. We've been writing, yelling, crying, talking to the US Air Force about why we need hardened aircraft shelters for probably 30 years now. You can go back, you can read a lot of reports on this. There aren't many analysts who would tell you this is a bad idea. The US Air Force so far has built 0 since we've started lobbying for them. So I think in the Japanese case, are they going to be more willing? Doubtful, right? And then personnel, of course, the other services would kick and scream, as well as probably the finance ministry and everyone else. So I have a vision, sort of where Japan might go if it wants a survivable, effective, lethal Air Force. But I think the obstacles are quite high to getting there. I don't want to be unrealistic about that. Hopefully they will move in this direction some distance. I think there's some cause for hope. Yeshiva is iconoclast and actually has some defense expertise. I looked in vain for names and what I could call this scheme of operation. Couldn't find a good one. But I mean, the point is here that you create a form of air power that can absorb punishment, that is resilient, that can continue to operate despite taking some punishment. I'm sorry for having gone on so long.
Thank you very much. We will now turn to you for discussion to be led by Hiroyuki Kobayashi from the Japan Air Self-Defense Forces. Kobayashi-san, I turn the floor over to you.
Thank you for your detailed and thought-provoking analysis about our air power. I'm one of the associate of the U.S. Japan program. My question is about the future Japan Air Self-Defense Forces post structure in 2040. I'm very interested in the roles of the manned fighter jet in the future. It's because you mentioned about the increased number of the manned aircraft and enhance the UAV, mid-size UAVs. That's so reasonable for us, but we will have some opponents to argue the effectiveness of the manned fighter jets or the difference between the manned or unmanned for the conditions. What do you think about the future role of the manned fighter jets? And if you have the basis for calculation, the number of the manned fighter jets in the future?
Great question. I'll lead with the bottom line, which is no, I don't have a calculated basis for my number there. Other than if you want a large fleet of UAVs, you have to free up funds. But the role, so there's going to be an evolution where it's hard to do without manned aircraft. You couldn't do without them today, obviously. A manned aircraft brings, that aircraft brings all of the functions together. It's got sensors on it. It's got weapons on it. It's got the pilot, a thinking, essentially human being on it. Probably the first thing that's going to happen is you will have paired manned and unmanned aircraft. So the unmanned aircraft can perform a variety of functions for that pilot. It can be a decoy at last resort, but it can also carry missiles for it. It can go ahead and provide, reconnaissance for the air mission. It can do a variety of things more cheaply and what the Air Force calls attritably. In other words, if you lose it, it's not the end of the world, right? So it can do it more cheaply. So if you send this thing ahead to scout and you lose it, you might have lost $10 million, as opposed to losing a pilot, invaluable, and also a $100 million aircraft. So I think that would sort of be a transitional stage. I do believe that these mid-size UAVs can perform some functions independently, even today. Certainly some types of ISR functions, and potentially, other functions as well, like, for example, defending high-value air assets. So you have aircraft with no defenses that I already spoke about, for example, tankers and AWACS that sort of fly around in, sort of racetrack patterns and support the air campaign that's going on. Currently, you have to protect those with manned aircraft. So you're using up 2 or 3 fighters to protect this tanker. Potentially, mid-sized aircraft with air-to-air weapons could protect the tanker and at least fire some shots that'll keep the adversary's head down and provide an avenue of escape for that high-value asset. So I do think we're going to see more and more functions. We're on the cusp of seeing these UAVs perform more and more functions. And I have not done the numbers. I don't know why I said 100. Just one last comment about the shape of Japan's Air Force. One thing I didn't talk about was the F-35B. So the F-35B can, short takeoff and landing. So that does solve part of Japan's problem with regard to the vulnerability of air bases, since it can effectively take off from a variety of locations, not necessarily air bases. So that's one part of the answer, I think.
I have a number of questions then. I would like to ask, but I would really like to hear more from the audience. If you could identify yourself, please.
Hi, I'm Kira Coffey. I'm an Air Force C-130 pilot. I'm over at the Belfer Center International Security Program Research Fellow right now. Just a question. I can appreciate that the Air Force is looking for an analysis based on cost, right, and attritability. I can appreciate that. My question is in coming up with your notional projections for the Japanese Air Self-Defense Force, are you measuring the gap in the loss of combat effectiveness compared to survivability? Because it would sound great to be survivable, but if we don't have the effect in the end game of being able to have a strike capability, where are we at then?
So I think the only way to answer this question is to actually war game the campaign. You can't really do it with a closed loop model, so that will be one function towards which we put the wargaming, I think. So you're right, you won't be able to lift as many weapons into the air, so you won't have the same air-to-air capability, you won't have the same strike capability, ... if that aircraft survives. That's the real problem, right? So if all the aircraft are killed on the air bases, then your UAV fleet looks much more capable than your manned aircraft fleet. So you really have to sort of do the campaigning, the campaign analysis, and look at different options. So it is possible that if you combined a variety of defensive measures with a larger contingent of manned aircraft, maybe that's the optimal solution. Maybe that's better than a large fleet of UAVs, right? But I think you do have to run those numbers and see what kind of answer you get. You'll have to make a lot of assumptions along the way, like what you think these UAVs might be able to do in the future. But right, we have to play it. We have to look at the vulnerability of the aircraft on the ground as part of that larger equation.
There's a question from one of our online participants, which is very similar to one of the questions I was going to ask. So let me take this opportunity. Jeffrey Horning has sent in a question. Civilian air bases don't have any necessary supporting infrastructure, i.e. specialized fuel, supplies, parts, munitions. I would add, you said the word maintainers once in your presentation, and as we are learning now, UAVs need maintenance too. So getting those, continuing with Jeffrey Horning's question, getting those up to par will be very costly. Have you included that? Finally, for UAVs, what type of infrastructure is needed to get Japan to be able to target ID battlefields? In other words, you defined the problem as dealing with the attacks on ramp space and airstrips. If I were designing the attack, I'd go after the support facilities, which are much harder to disperse, replicate, are fixed, and not that hard to target. And your UAV fleet will very rapidly lose capability without the ability to fix them up, refuel them, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. That means, at least in my mind, some of the other options that you put aside at the beginning might start looking more worth investigating.
On that, the other options that I put aside at the beginning.
Road mobile ballistic missiles.
Oh, I see. Okay. All right. Yes. Hello, Jeffrey. I don't know which camera you're viewing from, but good to hear from you. So couldn't agree more with the question, right? I think I had it on one of the slides, probably one of the latter ones that I went through quite quickly and glossed over, but any sort of air power strategy that is survivable and resilient is going to require a larger investment relative to the overall force in infrastructure. And that infrastructure is going to include material, like hardened aircraft shelters, and personnel and maintainers. So a few years ago, we wrote a big study about sort of recommending some changes for the US military. In that, we suggested increasing the contingent of maintainers, right? The total number, decreasing the size of squadrons to make them a little more deployable and flexible. So I think all that's going to be necessary. That's one of the reasons we go from 50,000 to 75,000. And again, that is not fully digested work yet, but I would anticipate the number of personnel is going to be, the requirement is going to be very high. It's also true, and a great point, that everything it's very hard to imagine a military system, by which I'm including here everything from supply, maintenance, et cetera, to the actual weapon system, that doesn't have some sort of vulnerability on the ground. So ground launched missiles have been put forward as an answer to air power. Could be, I mean, again, I think you want to do sort of the whole cost benefit assessment, cost effectiveness assessment. But neither those ground-based missiles nor the UAVs that I'm talking about are really going to be independent of fixed targets. You're always going to be giving the adversary some fixed targets, because the munitions that go on that aircraft, the reloads for these ground-launched TELs, the transporter erector launchers, are going to have to go in ammunition warehouses. You're going to have a lot of back-end facilities that are targetable. So I think they're a little bit less targetable and a little bit less vulnerable than having $100 million aircraft sitting out in the sunlight on the tarmac. And that's the part that I really have trouble getting over. They're just sitting there waiting to die for, you know, a hand grenade size munition to destroy them. So I think they're less vulnerable, but there are a lot of requirements there. So I'll come back to Kira's earlier point, which is, you know, how we think about this. And how I think about this is each aircraft today is far more lethal. You know, if you've got 2 LRASM, that is a very long range standoff anti-ship missile that is stealthy, incredibly, you know, lethal piece of military hardware. They're also much more vulnerable to the same by the adversary, whether it's a ground launcher, whether it's an aircraft. So I think how you want to think about this is smaller numbers, more survivability. Everything's got to be built around survivability and resilience. That's not a great answer, but it's.
Oh, yes, I would love to continue this
Yeah.
discussion, but again, other issues. Sir, in the back, if you could identify.
Hi, yes, Koichi Nakano, also at the US-Japan program. And I'm a political scientist, but a complete layperson. So it's more of a question ask the expert from a very naive point of view, quite probably. But well, I understand the many hurdles that seem to be honest, quite insurmountable. But on top of that, I guess, you know, Japan is not as bad as Taiwan, but it's of course much smaller than the perceived adversary, China, and it's not an ocean away like the United States. And so I'm not quite sure what your sort of, you know, analysis in terms of, because I can't imagine that Japan will be leap forward to that, you know, given the obstacles, even in 10 years, 20 years. And then in the meantime, Japan will keep shrinking and its economy is unlikely to be spurred by this massive spending in the military, given the military industry in Japan is far smaller than that in the United States. And so how are you going to finance that on top of the shrinking population? And of course, strong aversion to war in general. But the point is also that China is not going to wait, right? Given the arms race, given the hostile move from their perspective in terms of Japan rearming and strengthening the alliance. And so what is your view in terms of the arms race, in terms of security dilemma? What is China going to do in order to, you know, counter what Japan would be doing in the next 20 years, let's say? That seems like also short term. So that adds to the sort of, you know, the difficulty to sort of accept this as a feasible plan. Is it ever going to be enough? And in that respect, I took it more like, you know, Japan should be doing this in order to say to the United States, please stay, please come to help, so that we're going to stay for longer, but not for too long anyway.
Good. Those are all good questions. And when you have answers, let me know. So, you know, it's a very difficult problem. There's no denying that. Say a few things. First of all, Japan has, you know, I think it's fairly evident, woken up to the problem. So it's committed to increase defense spending to 2% of GDP from 1%. Now there's some accounting games that are going on there. So it's not really doubling spending, but it is increasing spending very significantly. And, you know, despite Japan's economic woes, 2% should be affordable, possibly more. I guess another point here is China will react, you know, this military competition will not end. China's economic growth, though, is plateauing, right? So if you look at sort of the overall balance of power as far as sort of expendable resources are concerned, it is beginning to hit a plateau where it's going to have trouble hitting 5% growth this year. And I think the long-range projections are sort of 3%, then 2%. Now, the military itself will continue to evolve. A lot of its systems are quite new, so its stock of military equipment is going to continue to go up relative to ours. But it's not going to go up by 10%, right, anymore into the future. That's one point. Another point is Japan's not alone. So Japan and the US forces that are forward deployed to Japan effectively need to be able to blunt an attack, not defeat an attack. What needs to be able to defeat an attack is everything that's forward deployed plus what the US brings during the course of the conflict. So it will bring a lot more assets and deploy them, you know, into the region. Returning to Japan, what it can do, the analysis should be budget neutral. I'm not saying that it is yet because I haven't really done the serious, you know, budget analysis that we're going to need to do to finish a paper. But the point would be to have sort of budget neutral options, right? So you're shifting away from Airpower forms that don't make sense, aren't survivable, won't really have the types of effects we would like, to something that can survive and operate. Stephen may be right that maybe this isn't the solution. Maybe there's some other things like, you know, maybe it should be more ground-based, potentially ground-based missiles. But I think this is certainly an improvement on what we're looking at now, which is a bunch of aircraft parked in the open and the, you know, Fuji's and Metsusetsu. Taiwan has moved in this direction. Many years ago, was it at the Naval War College who wrote about the porcupine strategy for Murray, right? Thank you. Bob Murray wrote about a porcupine strategy for Taiwan. I think probably it's time for Japan to start thinking a little bit more along those lines. Survivability, you know, dispersion, attritability, smaller systems.
We have gone slightly past our scheduled ending time, but let me thank you, Eric, for an extremely careful and insightful analysis of the problem. We can argue about the solutions, but I think we all agree that you pointed to a really, a very real problem that deserves more attention. Thank you very much for your talk.